Concord. What a miserable pile of human excrement that was. Listen, I know we all got our licks in on Concord ages ago, and the joke has long since ceased being funny, but I've been thinking about it quite a bit recently, and what a fascinating failure it was. It still baffles me after all this time, so I thought I'd like to give my perspective on why the game was so baffling, and why it was such an ungodly failure to the point of being shut down, only 2 weeks after the game launched, despite somehow managing to cost in the range of $200 to $400 million, making it one of the most colossal failures in the history of video games. To me, Concord was one of the most misguided projects I've ever seen, and considering what the gaming industry has gotten up to over the past decade or so, that takes a lot into account. It's baffling to the point that I have a hard time reconciling the type of failure it was. Of course, if you followed me for a while, you may be mistaken in thinking that I'm fundamentally against multiplayer games as a concept, as I had at one point expressed the opinion to that effect. So you'd think seeing a big multiplayer game fail is inherently a big win for me, but neither of those things are the case. I do actually enjoy playing multiplayer games. I've come around to them. It's not the thing that I primarily like to do as far as spending time playing video games, but I do enjoy some of them. Like, there was a period of time when I was addicted to playing the Texas Chainsaw Massacre video game, which I've since stopped playing ever since it started to become overpopulated by sweaties and not enough casuals. These days, I like me some Marvel Rivals. It's got a good range of characters, it's got a fun primary gameplay loop, I'm actually pretty good at it, and it's also the game that introduced me to Jeff the Landshark, which is now currently my religion. Long story short, I like multiplayer games to a point, and considering that I tend to enjoy PlayStation exclusives, you might theoretically turn around and say this game should have been right up my alley. Except absolutely not. There wasn't even an inkling in my mind about whether or not I'd be buying this game, even though I would say by all rights I would be the primary target demographic. That right there should have set the tone for what I could have expected leading up to its release, but even I couldn't predict what was to come. But I say leading up to its release as in the last couple of days before release, because that was pretty much when I'd actually heard of the game for the first time. I'm not kidding. At the very least, that's when I mentally internalized that it was a thing. For something that cost so much money, it astounds me to this day that it could be so nondescript as to be almost invisible even to someone like me all the way up to the game coming out. Apparently, it was announced at a PlayStation showcase in May of 2023 and had a 7-minute trailer. I say apparently because I did not remember it at all. To the point I'm not even sure if I was watching that showcase. Either I wasn't watching, or it was such a steaming pile of nothing that I couldn't even recall. I feel like in my position it's easy to distinguish what is and is not something worth paying attention to. I was there when The Last of Us was originally announced. It felt like a big deal. I never felt like this game was a particularly big deal. It certainly didn't grab anyone's attention, given that despite the fact that I know at least a few people I knew were watching the showcase when it got announced, and yet they never talked about it, and I also never saw any news outlets covering the game. And if I didn't initially catch the trailer, at most I probably scrolled past the trailer without even paying it a second thought, because it just looked like some nondescript trailer for a nondescript game that would probably come and go and nobody would care. Everything about it, from the marketing to the production to the gameplay, screamed lower tier fiscal report filler. It feels like a game that probably could have been made for $20 million. Not, and let me make this perfectly clear, a $200 to $400 million game. I still can't believe that's what this game allegedly cost. That's the part I can't mentally reconcile. The fact that this game cost so much and still managed to not be something I'd heard of. They paid more money than I will ever see in my life for pure consumer apathy. Do you want to know when I first heard about this game? It was when a couple of my colleagues were sent emails directly by Sony PR people. Now, to give you a peek behind the curtain, when it comes to major releases, usually just getting a free early access copy under the condition that you cover the game when it releases is enough to entice a lot of people in this line of work. It's a mutually beneficial partnership. They get free publicity, we get a free game, as well as the ability to strike when the iron's hot. Oftentimes, if you're big enough on this platform and are known for covering certain varieties of games, you find yourself getting emails like this from PR companies completely unsolicited. And like I said, multiple people I know were offered to play Concord early, so it may come as a shock to you to know that of the people I know who had the offer given to them, not a single person I talked to on a regular basis took the offer. So right from the beginning, there was a major issue as far as public interest was concerned. I didn't get offered, but even if I did, I probably would have turned it down because, much like them, I didn't find that it looked interesting enough to care once I saw the game for long enough to internalize it. But even at this point, leading up to the release, I didn't feel like there was much of a marketing push for the game. I wasn't exactly seeing trailers on TV or anything. Finally, the time came for the game to drop on store shelves, and the game somehow managed to sell an incredible 25,000 units. Keep in mind, this game had a simultaneous PS5 and PC release, meaning this game had access to a user base significantly higher than just the PS5 alone, and it sold 25,000 units in the time it took for the game to be discontinued, despite the backing of a multi-billion-dollar company. Given how much money was sunk into this, and given how much apathy it inspired, the problems couldn't possibly begin and end with the fact that the game was poorly marketed. Surely if this game was either on the homepage of Steam or the PSN, that it would have sold more than that if it had any appeal whatsoever. Because there have been games that I hadn't heard of before they came out which became successful just through sheer word of mouth. Expedition 33, for example, is a critical darling that has sold tons of copies despite the fact that I didn't know what the hell it was even a week before it came out. And now to this day I have people who I respect, and even a few people I don't, hounding me to play it. For the record, I'll get around to it, I've been busy. Then there are games that are pure independent works that don't have 1/10 the budget that this had, and yet were still able to be blockbuster hits. Silksong, for example, came out to such fanfare it crashed Steam briefly. Sure, Silksong was an anticipated game, but it's independently funded and managed to sell an estimated 3 million units in one day just through an established fan base of the first game combined with good word of mouth. So if you ask me, a flop of epic proportions like this only happens if there's a fundamental lack of appeal. And I'm not sure how much of a hot take this is, but I'm sure this has been said a million times. I think it mostly comes down to the fact that it was a very outdated style of multiplayer game. But I don't mean style in terms of gameplay, I mean style in terms of how it was sold. Let's not mince words. This game was attempting to be like Overwatch. It was a multiplayer hero shooter with what was ostensibly a wide range of appealing characters for you to choose from, each with complementary skills, weapons, and personalities. Apparently this game may have even started development as early as 2016 as well, which would make sense. If this game was trying to bank off the success of the original Overwatch, it would have probably started when Overwatch's popularity was at its peak. But here's the funny thing, when Overwatch came out, it was a standard $60, because that was during an era when that was the standard for every game made by a big publisher. Regardless of whether or not it was a single or multiplayer game, you were expected to pay the full price for all games under these banners. This even goes as far back as when I was in high school, where pretty much everyone with a Y chromosome that I knew bought the new Call of Duty Day 1 just so they could play multiplayer for a dozen hours a day. Theoretically though, it was inherently restrictive because while it was a big social thing at the time, not everybody could afford the game plus the battle pass, nor was everyone's parents willing to buy the game for them because of the M rating. That was just a universal truth of multiplayer games at the time. If your family was, shall we say, financially challenged, or if your parents were more apprehensive about letting you play M-rated games, you were left out. Not every multiplayer game was M-rated, but you still had to deal with the monetary aspect. But then everything changed in 2017 with a little game called Fortnite Battle Royale, which completely upended the multiplayer market. It was far from the first major multiplayer game to go the free-to-play route, but something about this game in particular caught on like wildfire. It was simple and accessible, it was available across all different platforms, and took what was already a popular concept, the multiplayer shooter, and blew it up to a 100-person battle royale. That does come with a caveat though. As history will tell you, the Battle Royale portion of Fortnite was ripped off from another game, that of course being PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds. A game that had a massive boom and even to this day continues to be a big game, especially in countries like India. But there was one crucial difference between the two. Fortnite was free. It would introduce a lot of cosmetics as purchasables, but the core experience is something that could be experienced by anyone free of charge. Meanwhile, PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds was at the time a paid product. Therefore it was slightly restrictive comparatively. And for whatever reason, taking the core fundamentals of the already popular PUBG and making a version of it that was free to play and also cartoony enough that most parents wouldn't mind their kids playing, you end up with what is to this day the biggest multiplayer phenomenon in all of gaming. It essentially became the virtual water cooler for people of all ages. Even I'll play it occasionally. I know some people think that playing it somehow taints you with original sin, but to me it's just a game that's somewhat amusing and has a good social element to it. I have some busy friends I don't talk to nearly enough. Every now and again we'll get together for a couple of games and catch up. It's a multi-million user chat room with guns basically, and the fact that it became so ubiquitous so quickly means that the free-to-play multiplayer model kind of became the standard from that point forward. Fortnite drew the line in the sand. On one side, you have mostly single-player story-driven experiences that you pay full price for, and on the other side, you have primarily multiplayer-only games with no narrative aspect, which are free to play, but have additional cosmetics you can buy. Why did it catch on so fast? Well, the way I see it, it's because there was a combination of the game-playing public collectively deciding that after seeing how Fortnite did it, that they no longer wanted to pay full price for multiplayer-only games anymore, and market researchers smartly realized that this was going to be the case going forward. So from then on, you had a lot of games, some of which succeeded, some of which that failed, that adopted this business model. Like Multiverses, that new Skate game, Fall Guys, Valorant, Apex Legends. Even Call of Duty, once the king of the multiplayer shooter, adopted the Fortnite-style free-to-play model with Call of Duty Warzone. It's a game that completely redefined the concept of multiplayer games, and you probably know where I'm going with this. Concord was at the very least a game that was primarily multiplayer, but was a full-priced premium release. Well, not quite. Apparently it was launched at a slightly more reasonable $40, but the point still stands, and so what it ultimately came down to with that game was that it existed with an outdated business model. Expecting people to pay full or at least partial price for a style of game they had collectively decided they weren't going to pay full price for anymore as of 2017, which, if the game began being made in 2016 and was inspired by Overwatch, made sense, as that was probably the last bastion of this style of game succeeding. And somehow, between the initial conceptualization and the game's release, nobody stopped to consider whether or not they should update the business model, because somehow Sony at this point was going to be the only company in the entire gaming industry that didn't understand that multiplayer games were no longer being sold for premium prices. I honestly put that down to Sony arrogance, if I had to guess. The PlayStation was king shit a fuck mountain in the 8th generation, and it wasn't even close. And while these days they tend to get outsold by the Switch, as far as dedicated home consoles are concerned, the PlayStation is still king shit. Plus, first-party PlayStation games tend to sell pretty well. Hell, Horizon Zero Dawn sold so unbelievably well that there are people to this day that still believe it was somehow an industry plant. Doesn't work like that, sorry. You can't have an industry plant in an industry where you have to pay for something before experiencing it. I know it was part of a bundle, but you still had to buy the bundle. Point is, I think coming off the success of the PS4 into the success of the PS5 has left Sony feeling a bit arrogant as far as how it pertains to the PlayStation brand. So somebody high up, or perhaps an entire segment of the company, probably decided that people were obviously going to pay for their multiplayer game because it was theirs. And that obviously didn't pan out, especially because if the primary audience for first-party PlayStation games are usually fans of single-player narrative-driven games, then why would those same people buy a multiplayer-only game? Of course, there's the question of the chicken and the egg. Is that the thing that fans of first-party PlayStation games buy because that's what they usually make, and so the audience eventually built itself around that sort of thing? Or is it a case of those types of games having been their biggest hits, so they decided to double down on it? Either way, if your audience will buy things like Ghost of Yotai or God of War Ragnarok by the millions, those types of people probably aren't going to buy your Overwatch clone just because it's made by you. Meanwhile, fans of multiplayer games especially aren't going to buy something just because it's made by you if you haven't traditionally made games that appeal to them. So it didn't appeal to multiplayer fans, it didn't appeal to PlayStation fans, it certainly didn't appeal to anyone on Steam, so it kind of ended up in a point where it pretty much didn't appeal to anyone. Plus, I also think there's another aspect that prevented this game from catching on, and, well, there's no other way to say this, so fuck it. The game just isn't sexy enough. To be clear, I'm not going to use the W word because I am hard line against using meaningless buzzwords in place of actual criticism or analysis. When I say this game isn't sexy enough, there's a reason for that. A significant reason of why Overwatch was able to catch on the way it did was, let's be honest, because the game is filled with a ton of conventionally and unconventionally attractive people. Characters that appeal to most tastes. There's a reason why there's a certain 4-letter P word that this game was famous for from the moment the beta dropped, and there's a reason why Blizzard attempted to encrypt the character files extensively when they released Overwatch 2. Extensive encryption that was cracked within 4 days, I might add. I'd imagine they probably could have done it in 2 if they used both hands. Like, let's not kid ourselves. There have been a number of game franchises in the past that have survived and thrived purely off a mutual horniness between the audience and the developers. Like Shantae, for example. That's a series where the business model is practically come for the absolute shameless horniness, stay for the good gameplay. And I'm not judging. That's a legitimate business model, and guess what? It seems to have worked for them. Of course, that's not a guarantee of success. Just ask the dozens upon dozens of games that have attempted to mooch off the success of Genshin Impact. Now, am I saying that Concord should have been Gooner bait? No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, the first bite is with the eye, and if you're gonna make something that is primarily a multiplayer game without much story, without much context, and where your entire opinion of a character will basically come down to their appearance and a few different voice lines, then you are advised to make the game, if not sexy, at the very least visually striking in order to catch the audience's attention. Give them something to latch onto, and give them something that can appeal to them. Because there's not much else you can use to get their attention for a game like this, and I'm sorry, but the art design in this game is some of the most bland I've seen. I look at these characters and I see some of the most hilariously muddled and indistinct designs I've ever seen. Despite being over-detailed, there's somehow nothing that really sticks out. It's just a bunch of visual white noise to me that's attempting to convey a sense of irreverence, but in a corporatized and sanitized way. Like, committee-designed quirkiness. Whether it's humans or aliens with hypercolor skin, I see a lot of people with very standard body shapes in either bland sci-fi costumes or bland regular clothes, occasionally with different colors, like this guy in the cowboy hat with the teal jacket, as if using color as a replacement for having a unique character design or costume. The most distinct character design is probably the recycling robot, but even that just looks like a yellow trash can with arms and legs. Or possibly the person with Space Marine armor with a color scheme that somehow manages to find its way in the middle of the three-way Venn diagram of bland, clashing, and indistinct.
Looks like a goddamn lamppost.
So I think I've discovered here that this game failed, largely because it was a game for nobody. It's a game that came out nearly a decade after the point in which it should have come out, given its business model, and the final nail is that it simply is not a good-looking game. It was a bold and arrogant misstep. Honestly, if they did spend a lot of money on marketing, that would be a shame considering the fact I barely saw the game be mentioned. But if they didn't spend a lot of money on marketing, then that's a good thing considering I'm reminded very fondly of Quibi, that attempt at a streaming service for the TikTok age that had over $1 billion of investment but managed to last all of 6 months. That was a streaming service where you had ubiquitous amounts of advertisements on TV and YouTube at the time, and yet it had abysmal amounts of subscribers. Ultimately, this simply serves as a cautionary tale. Make games for your audience and know which audience you're actually making games for. Don't assume based on past success that everything you make is going to be similarly successful. And just generally don't be arrogant. But you know what, it does highlight something for me that I genuinely appreciate about the way that multiplayer games have been redefined. I grew up in an era where pretty much every game had some superfluous multiplayer mode that died after 2 weeks. Obviously multiplayer modes that were afterthoughts, but still took up resources. But ever since that line in the sand was drawn, you generally don't get single-player and multiplayer games mingling in the same way you used to. Now the most you'll get is co-op games that can function as single-player games, but not many superfluous arena shooter modes in games that were built to be single-player. And to me, that's a good thing, because I'd rather you put all your eggs into one particular basket, because I don't think I've ever seen a game attempt to have a separate single-player and multiplayer mode and have them both be equally good. No, focus on one thing and do it really well, rather than try to do multiple things and do them both poorly. So there's one positive thing I can say about the modern-day industry. It's that more games are specializing and fewer games are attempting to be everything for everyone. And I will admit, there is a certain schadenfreude in watching an Icarus style fall from grace like this. It's nice to see a company like this have a massive flop every now and again to hopefully keep their collective ego down a bit. But Concord is also an example of how concerning it is that certain games can simply cease to exist. They gave out refunds, which is more than most companies will do, but this is still a game that God knows how many people put their heart and soul into, and to see it rendered completely unplayable forever is somewhat concerning in the sense that it's something that can happen at all. Even more concerning is that there have been attempts by fans to revive the servers, which have apparently been threatened with legal action. Stuff like that is extra concerning because that's a case where they're not making money off the game anymore. They've actively gone out of their way to prevent themselves from making money off the game anymore, and so what's the harm in letting what few fans are there try to play the game in whatever way they can? It just seems petty if you ask me. Whatever you want to say about the game, I'm sure it plays just fine. So why not let the people who played it continue to play it in such a way that it costs you nothing? I don't know, I'm just hoping that the Stop Killing Games initiative will sort things like this out eventually. In many ways, Concord was a dumpster fire, but that doesn't mean that it deserves to cease to exist. So those are my thoughts. I know this is a horse well beaten, but I found myself dwelling on the game recently, and I felt like I just wanted to talk about it for a little while. Plus, things are also kinda crazy right now in a way that I might be at liberty to tell you about soon enough, but not just yet. And I needed a bit of extra juice to fill out the schedule for the month while things are finalized. So that's all I've got. If you like this video and want to support the channel, be sure to leave a like, tell me what you think in the comment section, subscribe, and hit the notification icon so you're always up to date on what I'm doing. I've been the King of Snark Style right here on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you next time. Stay crispy, my friends.